everybody. Welcome to GCSE biology class for the MyTutor half-term sessions. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes while everyone arrives and then we'll start properly. Okay, so I think most people are here now, so we're going to start. So welcome to the last day of MyTutor's online lessons as part of half term. This is the final GCSE biology content session. We have got another exam technique session later this afternoon. So today is going to be on classification of organisms. And as I say, we're going to spend an hour on that, finishing off what we talked about yesterday. For those of you that were here yesterday, for those of you that weren't, don't worry. It stands by itself as well. Then we're going to have a half-hour break between 3 and 3:30, and then at 3:30 there will be an hour session on exam technique. So tune in then for examples of the sorts of questions that you might come across and how to tackle them. My name's Charlotte. I tutored the biology sessions as part of the online school over the summer. I studied conservation and biodiversity at the University of Exeter. And unfortunately, Olivia, who started tutoring these sessions over half term, has become unwell. So I'm taking over just for these last couple of sessions now. Okay, so let's have a look at what we're going to do today. So throughout half term, you've been talking about inheritance, genetics and variation. And today we're going to finish up that topic by talking about antibiotic resistance and the classification of organisms. So this follows on from the variation and evolution that we talked about yesterday. A little bit of housekeeping. So on the bottom of your screen, you've got the Q&A option and the chat option. Do feel free to post messages in there. So I will do a couple of stops for questions as we go along. Pop the questions that you have for the content in the Q&A if you can. That's the one I'll check first. But also I'm going to ask you some questions too, and try and keep the answers to those in the chat if you can. Okay. I think I can see a few more people trickling in, so hopefully you've managed to catch up. We haven't quite started yet. Okay. I think let's carry on from here. Okay, so as I said, antibiotic resistance and classification of organisms. So yesterday we talked about variation and evolution, and we talked about how everyone in a population is an individual and is different to the others. That difference can be due to environmental factors or genetic factors. And when we talked about genetic factors, we also talked about mutations, which are random changes in the genetic code, and how they contribute to variation in a population. Then we talked about evolution by natural selection, so how that variation within a population allows some individuals to be better adapted to their environment than others, and then how that means that those individuals are more likely to survive and to reproduce. And therefore, those characteristics that are an advantage to that organism get passed on to the next generation. We're going to put that knowledge into practice this morning by looking at a sort of specific case study, really, of very fast natural selection. And that is antibiotic resistance. So antibiotic resistant bacteria developed through natural selection as a result of random mutation. Got a really nice schematic here that we can look through to talk about that in more detail. So let's start on the left there. So there we've got a bacteria. Non-resistant bacteria exist. So bacteria that can be easily dealt with by antibiotics exist. Bacteria are really, really good at multiplying. They do it very quickly. So they multiply by the billions. And within those billions of bacteria that are produced during that multiplication, there will be a few bacteria that have mutations in their genetic code. Those mutations can either be advantageous or disadvantageous, and sometimes they have no effect at all. But just occasionally, some of those mutations make the bacterium drug resistant. So they make it so that the antibiotics don't work on them anymore. And therefore, in someone that has an infection, when an antibiotic is used to try and get rid of those harmful bacteria, the ones that have that genetic mutation that allows them to be resistant to that antibiotic will survive. They are therefore the ones that are more likely to multiply. And remember, bacteria are really, really good at multiplying. So that gene, that mutation that allows the bacterium to be resistant to antibiotics multiplies quickly. It's quickly passed on to the next generation. And before you know, resistant to antibiotics. And that's a real problem in our systems, because particularly if that happens in hospital, it makes things very difficult. Okay. So how to prevent antibiotic resistance? Oh, that's a bit, this MyTutor lesson space has squidged my slide a little bit, but I think we're okay there. So there are 3 basic things that you can do to prevent antibiotic resistance. The first is to not overuse antibiotics. They will not work for viruses. Antibiotic drugs are specifically designed to work on bacteria. They target different parts of the bacteria depending on the antibiotic. There's lots and lots of different antibiotics for lots and lots of different bacteria. So sometimes they target the cell wall of the bacteria, sometimes they target other areas of it. So they all work in different ways, but they won't work on viruses. They're just not designed to do that. So particularly for colds are usually caused by viruses. Antibiotics won't work for that. Similarly, quite topical, COVID-19 is a virus, and so using antibiotics for COVID doesn't work. It might work for some of the other sort of side effects of having COVID. So if you then become infected by some sort of bacteria as a result of your immune system being low, then you might use the antibiotics, but they won't work directly for a virus. So don't use them unless they're necessary. The second thing that we can all do when we're prescribed antibiotics, because we all will be at some point, is to finish the entire course. So quite often you get halfway through a course of antibiotics and you start to feel an awful lot better, which is great. And you then think, oh, I'm better now, don't waste the drug. I'll stop taking them now. But that's actually a mistake, because you can start to feel better while there's still a certain amount of the bacteria in your body. So it's much better to finish the entire course of the antibiotics, make sure you've got rid of almost the entire population of the bacteria, because then there's less opportunity for them to multiply and for that resistant mutation to occur. And finally, you can see just behind the blue line there, restrict agricultural use of antibiotics. So quite often, particularly in livestock farming, farmers will use antibiotics to try and keep their livestock healthy. And that's right, because we want to maintain really good animal welfare. So if an animal is sick, it's right to use antibiotics on it. But some farms will use it more as a preventative rather than a cure. So they'll just make sure that their entire flock of chickens or the entire herd of cows has a shot of antibiotic as a bit of a preventative. So if they've even got any small amounts of bacteria, that will kill them off. Now, that in principle sounds really sensible, doesn't it? But what actually happens is that overusing that antibiotic means that the bacteria are exposed to that antibiotic more and more often, which means that it's more likely, if that random mutation occurs that that gives resistance, that will then be multiplied up through the population, so that will be inherited on. So it's better to restrict agricultural use of antibiotics and, again, only use them when they're needed. So it's the same principle as with us in humans, really. I've put a little case study up here of MRSA. So I don't know whether any of you would have seen, but MRSA was a real problem in hospitals at around 2000 to 2010, I think. I remember it being in the news. And MRSA is a bacteria called methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And the clue is in the name there. So this particular bacteria is resistant to methicillin, which is the name of the antibiotic that's most often used to kill it off. And its peak, MRSA caused over 1,000 deaths every year in UK hospitals. It was really, really difficult to stop it spreading. And eventually we did manage to get a handle on it. And most of that came through improved hospital hygiene. So hand washing between patients by hospital staff, hand washing by visitors to the hospital as well when they came in and out, sterilising equipment between patients, even if you hadn't really used it, isolating infected patients so that they weren't able to expose anyone else to that resistant bacteria. And also the use of specific antibiotics for specific bacteria. So what I mean by that is that, as we said earlier, different antibiotics work in different ways. And so some antibiotics are more suited to certain types of bacteria. So rather than just using a general dose of antibiotics, thinking, well, that'll probably get it, it's good to make a bit more of an informed choice about the antibiotic that you're using. And that means you're only using the most appropriate and therefore the most likely to work. And so again, you're preventing that possibility of that mutation occurring and then being inherited through quite a big population of bacteria. Okay. And I've put a little note in red at the bottom there, saying that the development of new antibiotics is costly and slow and is unlikely to keep up with the emergence of new resistant strains. So antibiotic resistance is becoming a pretty big problem in the medical industry. We have more and more strains of bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, and we're not able to discover new antibiotics fast enough to keep up with that. So antibiotics come from a variety of different sources, usually plants, sometimes animals, and coral have been a good source of antibiotics. But the development of them into the antibiotic that you can use in a hospital is very costly and slow. It takes a lot of time to first extract whatever it is as part of that plant or animal that works as an antibiotic, and then to test it, make sure that you've got the right dosings, make sure that what you're using is safe. It takes a long time to do that, years and years. And so that is in direct contrast to how fast bacteria can multiply. I mean, they can multiply by millions in a very short amount of time. So it's very difficult to keep up with that. Okay. So let's pause there for some questions, because I've seen some coming up in the Q&A. So I will put the Q&A up now and I'll answer any questions. If you suddenly think of any, pop them in there, and I'll check the chat as well once I've been through the Q&A. Okay, someone's saying, can I move my mouse? Screenshot it. Let me move this back down so that you can see that. Okay, someone's saying that antibiotics could be painkillers for COVID. In some situations, they might be appropriate. But again, important to use the right antibiotic at the right time, yes, for particular infections. Yeah, someone making a good point that doctors used to give antibiotics a lot more frequently, even for relatively small problems. And that's one of the reasons bacteria is becoming resistant. Yeah, exactly. So we've all gone through a big learning process about bacteria and about resistance to antibiotics. And so doctors are being a lot more careful now about what they prescribe. And to do the Okay, someone also asking, how was MRSA wiped out? I think we've gone through that possibly after you asked the question there in that blue box. So it was basically wiped out through good hygiene. Because the more you can stop the spread and the more you can isolate bacteria, the more likely they are to be killed off and not be able to reproduce. Another question, how does swallowing soil help when you have consumed poison? I'm not sure. Is MRSA similar to coronavirus? That's a really good question. And the coronavirus is a virus. So they are completely different organisms, which actually leads on to our next section of knowledge. So we'll learn more about that. Are embryos used for antibiotics? Not that I'm aware of. What's the difference between new and old antibiotics? They all work in slightly different ways, so they all target slightly different parts of the bacteria. I'm not sure that that's a particular difference between old and new antibiotics. If I never have antibiotics but eat meat, will I have resistance? The short answer to that is no. There were some worries in the news quite a few years ago now, and occasionally they come up again about antibiotics being used a lot in livestock, so particularly cattle, I think was the one that was in the news, and therefore transferring some of those antibiotics to humans when they eat the meat. And I don't actually know where we got to in the evidence for that. So that was one concern. And again, another really good reason for only using antibiotics in animals when you have to. How does bacteria adapt as it uses mitosis other than through mutations? That's a really good question. So most of it is through mutations. But bacteria have some other quite complicated ways that they can gain genetic materials. So I'm pretty sure I'm right in this. The plasmids that bacteria have occasionally can move between bacteria. Do give that a Google if you want to, because it's not part of your GCSE specification at all. You don't need to learn that, but it's one possible other way. But mainly mutations. Mutations is what you need to know. Okay. Quick check of chat. Oh, my sound is cutting out occasionally. I'll just switch off my video briefly and see if that helps. There we go. Okay, someone, a really good question in the chat. Do we need to remember the case studies? No, not strictly, but they are quite handy to use in exams, and you might well have questions on MRSA. So they're quite a handy thing to have up your sleeve. Oh, another really good question. Will more livestock die with antibiotics because their immune systems become weakened because they cannot fight basic diseases as they're so used to having the antibiotics? Yeah, that is a concern. If you had a virus, would the antibiotics not help improve my symptoms, and would it not help to kill off the virus? No, antibiotics will not help to kill off the virus, and therefore any symptoms that you have that are being caused by that would keep occurring. So an antibiotic wouldn't directly treat the symptoms of the virus. What's the difference between antiseptic and antibiotics? So antibiotics are they're normally brightly coloured. They're like the yellow and red pills that you sometimes have to take for if you've got like an infection. Whereas antiseptic is something that is used to clean a wound. So antiseptic is something that like a gel or a spray or a wipe that you can use to clean, so to get rid of bacteria and viruses and stuff like this. What medication would you use to treat a virus? That's a really good question. So there are antiviral drugs, but they are much more difficult to develop and they take even longer than developing antibiotics. So no, you for a virus, as someone has correctly said a bit further down, the best thing is a vaccine. Can viruses form resistant strains? That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think my immediate thought is that viruses are very good at changing. So yes, in a sense, they would. Okay. So I've kept my camera turned off at the moment, just because the internet was a bit dodgy. I will turn it back on in a sec. So before we go any further, I think we're going to do a Kahoot. So move over to here. So Kahoot is great. For those who haven't played one before, you pop the link in on your computer. It's a very quick quiz, this one. It's 10 questions about variation and about evolution and the things that we've talked about today and yesterday in natural selection. And it's really fun. So I will just set it up now. And in a second, there'll be a link that you can put in if you want to. If you'd rather play along in the chat, then do. Oh, let's turn off that music. There we go. Okay, so you can go to www.kahoot.it, or you can use the Kahoot app and pop in this game pin here. Good, loads of people joining. If you don't want to join in, that's fine. Play along in the chat by all means, or just play along on a bit of piece of paper in front of you. See how your answers can compare. We'll see if we can break Kahoot with the number of people joining. This is great. Okay, I'm going to give 20 more seconds for people to come in, and then we'll start. So as I said, it's 10 questions, and you just need to click the right colour of the answer that you think is the correct one. And then we'll see who can do it quickest. So it's the quickest ones that get put to the top of the leaderboard. But as I say, there is no competition here, so just treat it as you would like to. Okay. What about 65 people? We've got about 99 people here, so that's pretty good. This will only take about 10 minutes, by the way. So, and then we'll go back to doing a bit more content. I thought it would be quite a good break because we had a lot of content yesterday. So it's a good chance to try your skills. Okay, I think we're going to call it there. Let's press start. So this quiz is about variation and evolution. Okay. First question, variation is caused by A, genes, B, the environment, C, genes and the environment. You have 10 seconds to pick your answer from genes, the environment, or genes and the environment. Okay, well done. I think that's almost everyone answered. Good. So most people got that right. The correct answer is genes and the environment. Really well done. Now let's see who clicked it fastest. Great Teacher and Mimi are up there at the top of the leaderboard, closely followed by Snail with a really great little emoji there, Doms and Rhea. Okay, next question. Question 2 of 10. What is genetic variation? Is it A, the differences between organisms, B, the differences caused by genes, C, the different traits of an organism, or D, the different genetics in organisms? Genetic variation. Okay. That one is a slightly odd question. So 38 people got that one right. However, I would say that the different genetics in organisms was right too. So 15 that got that, give yourselves a pat on the back. Okay, leaderboard has changed slightly with Hassan Ramal, Joe Biden coming up the leaderboard there. Question 3 of 10, what is mutation? A, when a gamete is damaged. B, when a species adapts to something new. C, random changes within the DNA. Or D, when an animal is irradiated. What is mutation? Okay, well done. Random changes within the DNA is correct. So a mutation is a random change within the DNA. So it's one of the bases that alters. Sometimes it's more than one, but it changes the sequence of the DNA. That means that the genes are altered slightly, which means that you may have characteristics that are beneficial, like resistance to antibiotics. Okay, Mimi, top of the leaderboard now. John Stowe Biden and Gigi Gamer following up behind. Question 4 of 10. A change in the genetic material that produces variation in a species may be the result of, my word, that's a long question. A, the struggle for survival. B, a mutation. C, the overproduction of a species. Or D, competition. Change in the genetic material that produces variation in a species. Okay, well done. 39 of you that got mutation. The mutations are changes in genetic material. Those of you that put the struggle for survival, so in a sense you're right, because a change in the genetic material might be an inadvertent consequence of the struggle for survival, i.e. those individuals that had the best traits for surviving in that environment are more likely to pass those on, but it's the mutation that provides that characteristic in the first place. So it's mutation is the correct answer. Great Teacher back at the top of the board there. Okay, question 5. What is natural selection? A, a few organisms are selected to be nature's lead roles. B, where nature is selected over certain political policies. C, organisms adapt to the environment and survive longer. Or D, the extinction of animals. What is natural selection? Okay, good. Most people got the organisms adapt to the environment and survive longer, which means they're more likely to reproduce. more likely to pass those genes on. Okay, Kevin. Kevin's come up the leaderboard there. New addition. Great teacher still at the top with Mimi not far behind. 6 of 10. What is a fossil? We talked about this briefly yesterday. So a part of an organism that's been preserved, organism or imprint that was buried and turned to stone, an imprint from an organism that has been preserved, or all of the above. You're good. There's a couple of people in the chat. You're doing well. Okay, well done those who put all of the above. So this is a lesson on reading the question carefully, which I appreciate is difficult when you've only got 20 seconds. So don't worry too much if you didn't manage to read it all. But a fossil is part of an organism that has been preserved. Well done, the 22 who put that. It also is an organism or imprint that was buried and turned to stone. But again, it's also an imprint from an organism that's been preserved. So the correct answer is all of the above. Remember yesterday we talked about there's 3 ways that a fossil can form. It can be the whole organism being preserved, say in ice or in peat bogs. It can be the hard parts of an organism being mineralized in rock. So that's what we think of when we think of a conventional fossil. Or it can be a trace of an organism being preserved in rock. So that could be like a footprint, or dinosaur droppings is another famous one. Okay. Oh, Ari has gone up the leaderboard. Look at that. Okay, 7 of 10. What is extinction? Food, animals dying out, plants dying out, or a species dying out. So think about this one. What is extinction? The official definition. Good. A species dying out is the official definition. So that may be plants, it may be animals, but extinction refers specifically to the species that dies out. Okay. Got loads of people on the leaderboard now. Harry's still at the top. Question 8 of 10. Define selective breeding. Choosing who to breastfeed, the selection between breeding of mammals, the selection and breeding of organisms for desired traits, choosing to breed a child or put it up for adoption. Excuse the spelling mistake there, that should be breeding in the blue option there. Good. Well done, everyone. The selection and breeding of organisms for desired traits. Okay. Oh, Selena coming in there. Right. 9 of 10. Penultimate question. Genetic engineering is changing an organism's genetic sequence, copying an organism's genetic sequence, transcribing an organism's genetic sequence, or growing an organism's genetic sequence. 5 seconds, 3 seconds. Oh, time's up. Good. Genetic engineering is changing an organism's genetic sequence. Well done, everyone that got that one. Okay, good job, everyone. Final question. What are GM crops? Great meaningful crops, gentrified molecular crops, genetically modified crops, or Okay, I think I'm back. I think my internet just cut out there for a minute. Tilly, can you just pop a message in the chat and say whether I'm back yet or not? Hey, okay, sorry everyone. My internet there, I think, just had a temporary blip. I'm going to keep my video off for a second. So I'm just going to share my screen and then we can go straight back. Okay, so I'm sorry everyone that didn't manage to play that last question because my internet cut out. But I'm hoping that I can see the podium at least. Well done, Hassan at the top. Oh, no, in the bronze position. Great teacher in second, and finally in first place, Ari. Well done. Good job, everyone. Okay, let's close that one then and return to our slides. Well done, everyone. I hope that was something fun rather than just learning content all the time. And I'm very sorry about my internet dropping out. I hope that will be it and it won't do it again. Okay. Right. So the next bit of content that we need to talk about is classification of organisms. So this means organizing living things into groups according to their similarities. And the first person who did this properly was called Carl Linnaeus. He was a Swedish botanist and he grouped organisms together according to their structure and their characteristics. And this was quite a long time ago, so Carl did the whole thing pretty much completely by what he could see. So he grouped together organisms that looked similar, that had similar characteristics or similar ways of behaving. And he devised this 7-tiered system. It starts with kingdom at the top. So for us as humans, that would be animals. And his system had 5 kingdoms. You can see them there. So 5 broad kingdoms of organisms. So prokaryotes, which would be things like bacteria, protista, they are also single-celled organisms, fungi, which is something different again, like mushrooms that you see, plants and animals. Plants and animals are the ones that we know of mostly. That there's these 5 kingdoms that he thought broadly defined all of the species that he could see. I'm going to try popping my video on because I think that might make this slightly easier. Okay, let me know if I start going again. Okay, after kingdom comes phylum. And phylum is another layer of classification again. So you're a animal, and then what phylum are you in? You're in chordates, and chordates are animals with a backbone. You don't need to know all of the specific phylum, there's quite a lot. You just need to know that phylum is the next level after kingdom. Then we move to class. And for humans, we're in the class mammals. So we have chordates with, we have backbones, and then we have fur, hair, or milk glands. Okay, then order. And within mammals, we're in the order primates. So we have collarbones and grasping fingers. Then family. So we are within the hominid family, which is primates with relatively flat faces and 3-dimensional vision. Then genus, and we're in the genus Homo. So hominids with an upright posture and large brains. And then finally the species. So our species is Homo sapien. So members of the genus Homo with a high forehead and thin skull bones. Okay. There are 2 main things that you need to remember from this slide. Actually, there's 3. You need to remember Carl Linnaeus. You need to, and his 5 kingdoms. So Linnaeus and his 5 kingdoms. You need to remember that order there. So you need to remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. One of the easiest ways to do that is to make up an acronym. So take the first letters of each of those words and make up a little sentence with them. You can do that with any words that you like, but worth making up one that means something to you. That's the ones that I always felt were best when I was learning. was the acronyms that meant something to me. The third thing that you need to remember is how to write the scientific name of an organism. So the scientific name of an organism is its genus followed by its species, so the two last levels of that classification system. They must be written with a capital letter for the genus, so I've done an example here, and then a small letter at the beginning of the species, and they should be written in italics. Or if you're handwriting them, you can underline them. So make sure in your exam that if you're quoting any scientific names, I underline them if you're handwriting, or if you're using a computer, then pop them in italics. That's the proper way to write them. Genus and species are usually in Latin, which is why they all sound funny, but Latin is a slightly more specific language, and it was the language that was always used by scientists, early scientists, so we've stuck with it. Okay, so that's what you need to remember from that slide. Now, I mentioned before that classification system was developed quite a long time ago by Linnaeus. So since then, we've been able to look at more about organisms than just the way they look or behave. So there have been advances in science, such as electron microscopes, genetics, lots and lots of different techniques that allow us to know much more about different organisms. And so we've kind of changed the classification system a little bit. So we now have a system called the three-domain system. And basically, this adds an extra level. So the animals are classified as domain before kingdom. There are three domains: archaea, bacteria, and eukaryota. So a couple of those words might be familiar, but archaea probably isn't. Archaea are very strange organisms. They basically don't really fit into bacteria or eukaryota. They're kind of everything else. Quite often extremophiles are in archaea, so that's not bacteria, that's organisms that can withstand really extreme conditions, so the ones that can survive in the really, really hot springs in North America are some of those. They're quite often archaea. Then we have bacteria and eukaryota, and eukaryota should mean something because you should have learned about eukaryotic cells. So eukaryota are animals. Okay, and then it follows the same system. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, all the way down to the bottom. It also has added on an extra kingdom. So remember, Linnaeus had 5 kingdoms. The three-domain system has 3 domains and 6 kingdoms. So those are the main differences. The 6 kingdoms are archaebacteria. They can't really decide what they are. They're not quite bacteria, but they're not quite anything else either. Eubacteria, that's your usual bacteria. Protista, those are other single-celled organisms. Linnaeus knew about them too. Fungi, plants, and animals. So it basically just splits the bacteria up there, or splits. So for Linnaeus, his were prokaryotes, whereas this system has split them into archaebacteria and eubacteria. Okay. You might get questions about classifying an organism. So you might get questions about how to write a scientific name. You might get questions saying that, tell us what order this organism is in, if you're given its full classification all through. That's usually a good one. There's normally like draw the line ones. And you might get a slightly longer question about the difference between the three-domain system and Linnaeus's original system, so the Linnaean classification system. So for that, you need to know there's an extra level, 3 domains, and that there's 6 kingdoms instead of 5. Okay. Okay, so having learned to classify organisms, you can then use that classification system to help build up an evolutionary tree. So now scientists can use microscopy, biochemical analysis, and DNA evidence to build evolutionary trees, aided by fossil evidence. So we talked yesterday about fossil evidence, about how, particularly for some organisms such as the horse, there's been almost a complete record of the change in what is now the modern horse over time. And we've got a pretty good record of that from fossil evidence. But there's lots of organisms that we don't have any kind of detail like that for. And so that's where microscopy, biochemical evidence, and DNA evidence can be really helpful in trying to work out who's related to who in in all of our organisms, really. So there's a little example here of an evolutionary tree, taking this from the AQA textbook. So evolutionary trees such as this show us the best model of the evolutionary relationships between organisms. So you can see here, you usually work from left to right, and you have what's called common ancestor. So each node on here, each little block, there, and there, each corner is an organism. So here we've got the example of red pandas and giant pandas. Both of them eat bamboo, and both have wrist thumbs, which help them grip the bamboo stems. So you'd assume that they're quite closely related. So if we look at this tree here, here's their common ancestor. But then we see that there's a split in the tree. So we go one way, and we have the bears that will eventually end up with the giant panda. So there was a common ancestor there, and that split into two. We've got other bears, so black bears, brown bears, grizzly bears. And then the other branch of the tree, there's a couple of extinct species there. And then we have the giant panda. The giant pandas are related to other bears, but they're kind of once removed, if you were going to talk about generational changes like your family tree. No mention of red panda there. So note we have giant panda and other bears, but no mention of red panda at all. Now you'd think red pandas, they look like bears. But if we go back to their common ancestor and we go down the other branch of the tree, we can see that on one side we have the weasel and raccoon families. And then we have the ancestor of what is now our red panda. So we've got several extinct species along the way. Then we get to the red panda. So, how strange is that? So using DNA and fossil evidence, we've found that two species that behave very similarly, that have similar adaptations, are actually not that closely related. So the wrist thumb, which they use to grip bamboo, evolved separately for each species. So they're not as closely related as first thought. So actually red pandas are more closely related to weasels than they are to giant pandas. So it's amazing that difference, whereas, Carl Linnaeus, if he'd looked at the two of them, he'd have classified them right next to each other. But nowadays we have a little bit more technology available, so we can do a bit more and work out exactly how all species are related. Okay. I'm going to leave that up there because the next slide is questions. So I'm going to just reload the Q&A and run through any questions. Okay, one question saying, will there be a Kahoot for the exam technique session? We'll see how much time we have. We're going to concentrate mostly on the types of questions that are going to come up. So we might not have time for a Kahoot, but we'll see. We're not going to do another one in this session, but that ends in 10 minutes. So what is a botanist? Is it a type of ecologist? Sorry, that was silly. I thought I'd put that on the slide. A botanist is someone that studies plants. Okay, do we need to remember all of the classifications in order for our exams? Yes, so you don't need to remember how like humans are classified there, but you need to know kingdom, phylum, oh, here we go. Kingdom, phylum, then is it order or class? Oh dear, this isn't very good, is it? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So let's make up a silly rhyme for that. So kings pick cats or ferrets, generally, sometimes. That wasn't very good. Make up a better one, but that's the best way to remember it. Okay. King Philip came over for green spaghetti. That's a lot better. Basil made that one up. King Philip came over for green spaghetti. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Oh, that's a good question. How long does it take for a new species to form? It can be hundreds of years. And actually, speciation is something that's covered in, I think, a slightly different topic. But speciation is very linked to natural selection. But obviously, if you've got a population and then say something happens and they end up either side of a really big river that they can't cross over, then eventually the characteristics that are inherited in each of those populations will be slightly different. And after a few hundred years, so many, many generations, they will be so different that they can no longer interbreed. And that's how a new species is formed. Okay, best revision methods. Amina, that's a really good question. For me, it depends how you learn. If you're really good at learning by looking at something, then look at as many things as you can. If you're really good at learning by hearing things, then record yourself saying, you can just record on your phone and just record yourself saying the main things that you need to remember and listen to them over and over again. Or if you learn by doing things, write things out over and over again. And most of us are a combination of two or even three of those. So I learn best by looking at something and then writing it down. So I would look at things, I'd make flow diagrams, I'd make funny little mind maps, anything that I can do to help me remember things. Acronyms are a really good thing to use as well. King Philip came over for green spaghetti is a really good one. And that might well help you to remember. Making revision cards is another really good one. So simplifying your material down, and as well as revision cards, which can include facts on them, you can do cards with questions on them as well, and then the answers on the back, so you can almost test yourself. That's a really good technique. Someone's saying, can you repeat how you would name them, Homo sapiens? So if we go to this slide here, this is how you would write down the genus and species, so the scientific name for an organism. So you put the genus first, followed by the species, and the genus must have a capital letter. And then finally, if you're typing, they need to be in italics. If you're writing them down, underline them. Do any good science or learning websites and science or biology YouTube channels? That's a really good question as well. I use BBC Bitesize a lot when I'm talking to specific students. I think BBC Bitesize is brilliant because it condenses everything down. They did start a YouTube channel, but I don't know how far they got with it. It was during lockdown, so I think it got delayed a little bit. If you want past paper questions, there's also a website called Physics and Maths Tutor that has some really good revision notes and specific questions by topic. So if you want to practice questions about a particular topic, that's a really good one to go to. If someone has symptoms of the coronavirus, can't they prevent it from further developing by having paracetamol for a headache? That's a really good question and a good bit of knowledge for us all there. So if you take paracetamol, paracetamol is a painkiller for a headache, you are treating the symptom. It will make your headache go away. It will not make the coronavirus go away. Because it's not treating the virus, it's treating the symptom. So well worth bearing that one in mind. If a person has heart disease, when they take medicine to thin their blood, what does the medicine contain to help thin the blood? There's several different blood thinners that you can take. So that's a really good question. There are specific chemicals that are used for thinning blood, and I can't remember the specific names of them right now, but there's a few that you can have, a few different ones. Warfarin, I think, is the main one, but there's a couple of others now because warfarin has some side effects. So normally they try and use the others now, I think. A quick check of the chat. 5 minutes to go. So any other questions that you have, fire them in. Let's have a look in the chat. Another good one there. Kings prefer candy over fresh green salad from Michelle. That's a really good one. I like that one as well. Robert asking, can I get a 9 if I start now? That's a difficult question to answer, but the general rule is that start as soon as you can. Start making revision notes whenever you can. So it depends. I know there'll be some people here that are just going into GCSE. There'll be some that are going into A level. There are some that are midway through both. So depending on where you are, depends on how much you need to start revising. But for GCSEs, it's certainly good to start revising your first year and your second year. Oh, another good suggestion there from Addie for free science lessons. Apparently that's really good. Yeah, well worth a try if you think that one's really good. What if we think we have some kind of infection, but actually it's a virus and the doctor prescribes and we take antibiotics ourselves, then what happens? I mean, nothing bad. It might well not cure you because it's an antibiotic, so it's not designed for a virus. Normally doctors are pretty good at diagnosing the difference, but there are some viruses that have very similar symptoms to some bacteria. So occasionally you might have to try both and see what works. Okay, so some good tips there from Jo. She tends to make revision notes for all the topics at once, and then after a week or so, they have trouble remembering the facts. Oh, do you have any tips on this? Yes. Sorry, I didn't realize there was a question at the end of it. It's really easy to forget things. You think you've learned them all, and then that's it. So the best thing that I find is to go through stuff straight after the lesson. So make some revision notes, go through what you've learned in the lesson, because sometimes in the lesson you have to think quite fast because the teacher's moving on. You've probably found it today. So it's good to just re-go over your notes after the class, maybe make them a bit neater, maybe make some diagrams and things. And then read over them occasionally, listen to them if that's how you learn. But the key to remembering them is to keep going over them, and then make sure that in the few weeks before your final exams, you go over them a little bit more, basically a little bit more frequently. Another question there. I'm really good at learning the knowledge and the facts, but I think I'm not good at answering the questions. Do you have any tips to improve and to get better marks? That leads me to an answer to one of the other questions, in that in half an hour's time, we're going to do a full hour on exam technique. So I will teach you what I think will help you to answer those questions in the best possible way. So in half an hour's time, at 3:30, we'll have that second session. Okay. Time's up, I'm afraid, for this session, everyone. So go and have a break, and we will see you in half an hour to talk through that exam technique. Thanks, everyone. Bye.